Hey everybody, we have a great guest for you. This is Remzo Martinez, author of Stay Away from the Libertarians, a book that I just started reading and I'm really enjoying it so far, and also a part of culture.
Remzo, thanks for joining us.
Gentlemen, it's great to be on. Thank you so much for taking the time in the middle of your day to have me on.
Well, it's been very inspiring so far what I've read about your journey, how you were, in a way, the odd man out, both in your high school and even in your college, even though that's more of an environment that you'd say was libertarian friendly. Could you talk a little bit about your starting journey? And I know you're younger than us. You're 25 years old, right?
24 actually, but thank you for thinking I'm a little bit older. You know, it's a bit of a pain in the neck whenever I go to order a drink or something and I still get carded. I have perpetual, 12-year-old face. So I've tried, whenever I'm working on another book right now, so I try and do the whole Ernest Hemingway depression beard, but it just looks like I'm going through puberty again. So it just doesn't help me out at all. It just looks like I'm a teenager. But yeah, they kind of jump on what you mentioned earlier. I like to start everything off with saying I was Mitt Romney's worst volunteer in 2012. Before I could knock on a single door, make a phone call, or register a single voter to vote, I ghosted them in the worst way possible, because I remember I was just a middle school during the Obama age of progressivism. It was supposed to be when social justice had a completely different connotation. Conservatives like social justice. To be against social justice meant you hated America. To a large degree, it still kind of means that now, but it was a lot more nuanced. It was a lot more mainstream back then. So here I am. I'm the token guy that likes to argue about everything. I said I was conservative at the time just because I knew that was the opposite of what everyone else was, but I didn't quite know any better. So around the time that I was graduating from high school, I needed to go ahead and fulfill some community service hours, because nothing spells volunteer service like being forced to volunteer, right? So we went ahead and did that, and I was allowed to use some hours from working on the campaign to contribute towards that. So I was like, I'm a little bit interested in politics. I need to get these hours out of the way. I'll go ahead and volunteer for Mitt Romney. And I thought, wow, this is going to be so great. He's the anti-Obama, right? Right. I didn't know any better. I'm looking down at everything and I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's just a white, less interesting Obama. Like, there's really nothing about him I could really think of that really separates him on policy.
Well, he was really into was he into universal health care? Was that one of his big similarities?
His claim to fame as governor of Massachusetts was Romney Care, which was essentially the predecessor to the Affordable Care Act. So that was his big thing. He was for an assault weapons ban. If anyone remembers the third and final debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, Mitt Romney conceded every foreign policy discussion to him. They're both globalists. They're big on defense. I mean, in terms of the things that mattered to me at the time, which was individual liberty, allowing yourself to live and others to live their lives as long as they're not hurting people and taking their stuff, you can go about and live your life in a free market upon voluntary association. But Romney wasn't necessarily for that. He said he was for Main Street, but this is a guy that spent his entire life on Wall Street. So I found myself completely disenfranchised. I go ahead and ghost the Romney campaign. So I'm hiding them. I'm blocking them on my phone. I'm like, just forget I exist. I end up doing something else for community service. So by the time the 2012 election hit, I went ahead and I ran for president of my school's Young Conservatives Club, thinking, oh, this will be great. We'll talk about the Constitution and all this other stuff. I remember my parents taking me to Tea Party meetings. I'm like, we can make freedom sexy again if we just have more fun than everybody else. But I run for president of that club. My good friend Zed Sheikh ran for vice president, and we ended up losing to the guy who was the secretary of the Young Democrats. And that really freaks me out. We lost by about 6 votes, and the biggest reason that people voted for him versus us was they said, well, obviously this whole conservatism, this freedom thing is outdated and people don't like it, and our goal should be to help Republicans win elections. So at that point, I do what any other disenfranchised young adult does. I went ahead and Googled all my thoughts and grievances, and I started seeing people like Hayek and Mises and Friedman, all these other guys. And I was just like, what are all these Austrian dudes? And what do they have to do with what I'm thinking about? So from there, I went kind of through the rabbit hole of understanding, Austrian business cycle and classical liberal theory. And that's what put me on one of the strangest, misadventurous periods of my life, which, is the crux and the backbone of the book from there. as I try and answer the question as to why all these lazy academics, fake news journalists, and corrupt politicians try and keep the libertarians outside the mainstream discussion every chance they get.
You mentioned Romney and Obama were both globalists. Could you explain what you mean by that and how you qualify that?
Thank you for asking that. And I really do want to say that one of the biggest problems we have in common political discourse right now is that we don't set up our terms. So the first term I want to kind of set up is globalist. And by globalist, I mean, in more of a political theory definition, it's anyone that gives more national sovereignty and authority to an unelected foreign body. So, for example, when John McCain was still alive in 2011, he went ahead and pushed through the Senate the Law of the Seas Treaty, the Lost Treaty. And what the Lost Treaty would have done was that would have capped the amount of naval military carriers that each country was allowed to have in the world. And this is already around the time that Obama was, limiting the amount of aircraft that we have in the South China Sea and, the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. So essentially what he would have done was he would have basically said, okay, other countries, you can keep the very limited Navy you have, but America, you have to go ahead and you have to downsize quite a bit. Now, what does that do? If we're going to jump with the theory that, promote peace but carry a big stick, what you're doing is you're basically putting yourself in the same, level playing ground as your enemy, which doesn't necessarily make much sense. So what this would have done was this would have gone ahead and limited authority overseas. Now, you have some libertarians that said, well, it's good because that way we could spend less time dick measuring on our naval power. We could spend more time being diplomatic. But the Law of the Seas Treaty was actually pushed by several other nations within the UN. And what they went ahead and they did was they lobbied John McCain to go ahead and introduce it to the US Senate, because laws from the UN cannot be forced or implemented within another country. So they need somebody else to go back to their home country and push it so that way it abides with UN standards and expectations. So they chose John McCain for that. The Lost Treaty was pushed by France, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. I wouldn't necessarily say that those are people that generally have American interests at mind. And that's just one thing itself. But when I mean globalist, I do mean people that give authority away. When I say nationalist, people have, you could put 6 people in a room, they're going to have 6 different definitions. But I see as someone that goes ahead and prioritizes their people over others. And I don't necessarily think it's necessarily how the left puts it, as in everyone else sucks and we're just great. But what it basically means is I'm not going to go ahead and limit the opportunity and safety and prosperity of my people for the sake of others.
I like seeing it as projecting a shining light upon the rest of the world as an example to follow. There was a reason why young people back in the Soviet Union were looking towards American culture as something worthwhile, while their whole society was starting to crumble underneath its own weight. So that is something that I think goes not just for military, but also for things relating to the internet, let's say. There was that recent podcast with Tim Pool and Jack Dorsey and the Indian woman that he had with her, and obviously Joe Rogan, where they were talking about online censorship. And Tim Pool made a great point about how the system that we have in place in America, where it constitutionally guarantees freedom of speech for everybody except for inciting the violence, that same principle could be upheld by Twitter, but instead they're going for a much more worldwide model, where it's not so much about the laws of America as it is about making sure that everybody around the world is able to use this thing. But I really wish, and maybe this is very nationalist of me to say, but I really wish that the model that is in America, as far as the internet is concerned, remains the same model and spreads through the rest of the world just like that. Unlike in England, where you have people registering to be able to look at pornography with the government.
This is awesome. I want to circle back again so that the globalism term is more and more clear, because I've heard so many different definitions of it. I've also heard people claim that globalism is innuendo or a dog whistle as a pejorative to like classes of people, which to me seems really inaccurate when I hear the term globalist. Like someone said, when Alex Jones says globalist, he means Jews or something, right? But then when you say Obama and Mitt Romney are globalists, like clearly that's not the case. So what specifically about Romney makes you say you think he's a globalist?
So I kind of put it in two examples, and I discuss both of them in the book. I look at our trade policy, and I look at our military policy. And people say foreign policy, which depending on who you're talking to, it can mean one or both or a conglomeration. But I try and say specifically when I'm dealing with defense, military policy, when I'm dealing with trade policy. Now, you're absolutely right. The definitions of both can get so misconstrued. I tend to freak people out when I say this, but I would consider myself, to a certain degree, a globalist. And by globalist, what does that mean when I'm applying it to myself? I mean, I want goods and trade and businesses to cross borders because, as Adam Smith and so many others mentioned previously, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So I'm all for an exchange of culture, an exchange of business, because when people are selling things to each other and they're buying things to each other, they're less likely to want to go ahead and bomb the crap out of each other. When it comes to Mitt Romney, it's really hard to say this because what you're essentially claiming is that you can really know what someone thinks. But I did read the book that he put out during the 2008 election, where it talked a lot about his ideology. But basically, he was a big supporter of NAFTA. Now, let's really go ahead and think of this. When we think of free trade, what should the perfect free trade bill look like? And when I was in college, I actually wrote a giant white paper.
No tariffs.
No tariffs. No tariffs. None of that. The perfect free trade deal is you guys can trade and we won't get in the way. And that's perfect. But when you look at things like NAFTA, for example, there's so much red tape in that. What you're basically doing is you're prioritizing who gets the monopoly on the cheapest labor to that degree. And when it comes to NAFTA, there were many problems with that. I wrote a white paper in college talking about why TPP, while good in theory, was bad overall. And, coming from a libertarian perspective, what TPP would have done was that would have put American trade laws, American intellectual property laws, and that would have forced it on all our trade partners. So IP, intellectual property, for example, that is not something that can be enforced internationally. It's one of those things where no international court will touch it because what you're doing is you're stepping on the sovereignty of other nations. Mitt Romney, he was actually a supporter of TPP in 2015, for example, and he dropped a lot of his talk when he was running for Senate in Utah. He supported it, but what he would have, his biggest support of TPP would have been, we're going to uniform all of our trade laws. So basically what that meant was everything that America thinks other countries should do, other countries are going to be forced to do. And there were a lot of people in the United States on the left and right that didn't like that. You had people in these other countries that were going to be part of TPP that didn't like that either. Wouldn't it have just been easier to say, okay, just eliminate the tariffs, let people trade and let them, come to their own private mediation practices, let them figure it out for themselves? Why do we need the government to go ahead and basically force another country to adapt to our laws? And it just got to the point where it was like, who's really writing this stuff? Who is really writing it? And when you look at a lot of the people that were in the private sector that were promoting TPP, I tend to like the Koch brothers on a lot of things. But the thing is, the Koch brothers are extremely corporatist in a lot of their policy. Their biggest thing is, we just want to go ahead and make sure that we have a market for the cheapest labor possible. And, well, that's good because if you follow, free market capitalist theory, that's going to go ahead and bring a lot of people up. In the same way, that gives a lot of other businesses authority that would typically be only seen in, let's say, a government, for example. What you have with Apple, which I've gone ahead and talked with Andrew Meyer from the Culture Team about on his show, American Revolution, is that, Apple, for example, which was also a supporter of TPP, when you go ahead and you look at their factories, what they did was they went ahead and when they moved into the rural areas of China, what they did was they hired a whole bunch of people to go burn down farms, go burn down a whole bunch of family cottage industries. Wow. And then what happens when you go ahead and you have a whole bunch of unemployed people and you've destroyed their income? They're going to have to move into the factory. So you have these people that are poor They're not very educated. They're stuck in this factory. They want to unionize. They want better standard of living. They want to go ahead and work in a place where the machinery is not going to kill them. So what did a whole bunch of Chinese Apple workers do? They went to the top of this one factory about 6 months ago, and they said, we're going to commit mass suicide if we don't get fans. We're talking about just electric fans to make sure that's not becoming 100+ degrees in the factory. So what did they do? Instead of actually listening to them voluntarily, working on collective bargaining, the factory supervisor put up a whole bunch of nets.
Because people are just jumping out the window and stuff.
Yeah, they're like, we don't care. You're gonna have to come down eventually, and if that's how you want to come down, we're just gonna put up nets.
If we're dealing with a country like China, which has all these authoritarian government mixed with business type policies, what would be the best way of dealing with that so that these situations wouldn't occur or would occur far less?
I think matching strength for strength is a big thing. And I get into the ire of a lot of my friends who are, let's say, Cato employees, for example, because I've said if we have to use tariffs in order to go ahead and combat somebody, I'm more than willing to do that. And then they get scared because they're like, oh, you're going against the sacred text of the prophets and everything else. And I'm like, listen, here's the thing. I believe wholeheartedly in free markets and the importance of voluntary cooperation and the nobility of profit and gain, and the ability to move up and down, a class ladder based on your own ability. But we live in a world with other people that don't believe that. And what are we gonna do? It's like we're Mormons.
Some people think their hands. Yeah. I think some people think, like you mentioned a couple of things. I want to keep circling back because this is such a great conversation, and I think we all have slightly different audiences, and people are becoming more and more familiar with these terms and becoming more and more interested in politics. Trickle down is something that I constantly hear in New York or LA circles as like a proof card that Republican tax theory or conservative tax theory is bunk. Like people should say, oh, didn't Reagan or Bush talk about trickle down economics, and we've disproven it. And I have always thought that trickle down is just a bad PR term, and it's a confused term because it's not trickle down. It's really about lowering the costs of living, and a rising tide raises all ships.
Absolutely.
If people are thinking about the economy like a finite pie, everyone thinks that they're fighting over a limited slice. They're not thinking of the economy like a bubble that can inflate and deflate, right? It's really all about how much value is in the system, right? Because money is just credit that represents human value. When you listen to postmodern money theorists or people who really love Keynesian economics, they think it's all black magic, that it's all imaginary, that since we no longer have a gold standard and the Fed issues our currency, it's all numbers on a page, and whatever budget Congress passes, they'll monetize. And even though they kind of know with trepidation, let's not go too far, because you see the systemic collapses in places like Venezuela. But then pundits and people with talking points will tell you how they're so much different from us, how that was a fluke. And when people are saying, well, actually, there were a series of predictable cascading events that led to that, people will say, oh, no, it's just corrupt Maduro, and it has nothing to do with just terrible economic theory. It's scary that, Lev's reading this article in New York Magazine that's saying, when did everyone become a socialist? So it's a topic that's really important to sort of like peel away all the layers of the onion so that people can look at it from every angle possible. But people are so prone to be triggered when they hear Cato, the Koch brothers, trickle down. It's like we're talking about voodoo or flat earth theory or something, when really it's so much more understandable than that. And I always resent when people in economics say, oh, economics is the dismal science. Nobody understands it, right? And there's a million different theories, and you pick your economist like you would pick a historian whose job is to generate culture, right? Whoever controls the past, controls the present and the future and that kind of stuff. So I'm very grateful that you're so knowledgeable about these things like TTP and NAFTA, and that we're talking about globalism, because when people are trying to call out Twitter yesterday, like Tim Pool was talking on Joe Rogan with Jack Dorsey from Twitter, it's like some people suspected that they're part of a globalist agenda, right? People would say those are conspiracy theorists to think that somehow they're invested in a specific globalist agenda, not one with no tariffs and free commerce and exchange of ideas in the marketplace, but one of government enforced oligarchy, where laws are being placed in favor of some businesses over others, and it's all about centralization and consolidation of power. And I feel like Twitter is not about so much like a public square that the Constitution would have admired. I think it's much more about a very specific egregore that they kind of see themselves as mental health and culture administrators. And so when Tim Pool is talking about how, you know, why are you imbalanced and sort of putting more pressure on these folk and not as much pressure on these folk, I think that Jack Dorsey might have been recruited by globalists, and this is something we need to talk more about. But I also think he genuinely believes in their economic model in terms of the best way to accelerate innovation would be if we got all the different governments cooperating and coordinating their tax dollars, when really you're slowing down the acceleration. That if you stopped globalizing this way, if you were able to localize and like decentralize everything, that you would unlock like the chains that are entangling the laws of acceleration. And it's so important because people used to be nihilistic about, well, what's the point of fighting this stuff? Politics is such a mess. You know, you're going to die anyway. And people don't realize that we're becoming masters of engineering with biology right now. You have people like Aubrey de Grey saying we might be able to create immortal people by 2037, meaning you can still die from a fatal accident, but you won't be dying from age-related diseases.
That's so freaky.
And the thing is, it's one of the reasons why libertarians and conservatives need to step up now more than ever to convey how quickly things can develop. If you look at Kenya and you look at South Korea, like 50 years ago, they were in the same place, and now they're worlds apart. And what was it that enabled one place to develop so much faster than the other, right? And it's not just voodoo. It's not just black magic.
Exactly. And I mean, this is one of the reasons why, you know, language is so important, because libertarians specifically, we do have a bit of a cult-like mentality, as in we use words and we use terminology and examples that most people are just never going to get, either in public education or just amongst their regular everyday life. That's why, you know, people didn't know what to take of my book. I didn't provide, you know, a subtext to it. The cover is as freaky as possible because I marketed this towards people who were not libertarians. And that was a big gamble, because if I wanted to make a little bit of money really fast and I wanted to just make a whole bunch of my other libertarian brethren happy, I would have done something like the virtues of liberty in a peaceful and cooperative world that enhances free choice and individual prosperity. And I would have, you know, shown Frederick Bastiat, you know, holding a child or something. No, I wanted to make it as vulgar and in your face and full of innuendos as possible.
This is also a bit of a trick title because people could look at it and say, hey, this may be an anti-libertarian read. I'm going to go ahead and purchase it.
Oh, I've got a story for you about that real fast. So I was on another show a few months ago, and the gentleman that was the host went ahead and picked up a copy of my book, and he was reading it at Chicago O'Hare Airport. And he mentioned to me that there was this older gentleman sitting across from him in the terminal who was just kind of like peeking over, just kind of looking at him as he saw the title and the cover. So he went over and sat next to him, and he was like, "Excuse me, sir, what are you reading?" And he looked at him and he was like, "Oh, I'm reading a book called Stay Away from the Libertarians." At that point, he really had no clue what the book was about. He just started reading it there. And he said, "Okay, you mind if I take a picture of the cover of it?" Now, the guy that was the host, he knew that the book was in jest. He didn't know full of what the whole context of it was, but he was like, "Sure." And he's like, "Are you interested in getting it?" And he was like, "Not me, but I think I want to get it for my son." And he was like, "Oh, is your son a libertarian?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of."
Wow.
So I can only imagine how he buys this book for his son, thinking it's going to go ahead and destroy all of his libertarian fantasies. And by the end of it, he's like, "Father, we have to abolish the state." So if I could get one person to do that, I would be so totally cool with it.
Well, there was an example you were writing about in your book of a teacher of yours, same one who recommended Dr. Zhivago, which is a book that I really want to read soon, and I know it's one of your favorites. He also had a list of these books that you are absolutely not allowed to read that are going to ruin you, and those were the first ones that you started looking into, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it had nothing to do with ideology. It had to do with everything about the fact that I was a smartass. And I'm like, oh, you don't want me to learn these things? Yeah, I'm going to go to Barnes & Noble right now. Here's the thing. Intrinsically, people don't want to be told what to do.
Mm-hmm.
They can be suggested things. They can be recommended things. But for me to tell you to do something, even if it's nothing like egregious, most people don't want to be told what to do. And that's the thing. So for him to tell me, a kid that was, more of a contrarian than anything, don't read these books. The only thing going through my mind is I like to get a rise out of people. So I'm going to go get these books right now.
And do you think that's what's going on the internet today, where you have a lot of kids who grew up during the Obama years who are now rebelling against what they see as this suffocating amount of leftism where, you have to be in a certain hierarchy of victimhood? And they see that as being utterly oppressive. But I think even more so, they see somebody who takes themselves way too seriously and is very sacrosanct about all of these concepts, like a lot of these people on Twitter are. So, of course, they're going to be the ones who are going to tell them to code. They're going to be the ones that are going to be sending Pepe memes to them. And it does get even worse as far as, like having Nazi imagery and all that kind of stuff. But I honestly think a majority of even those folks are just doing it to get a rise out of people. And I don't know what exactly this is going to amount to in the next coming years. So I'm curious of what your take is.
Yeah, and I think, I'm so happy that Jules brought this up with the Tim Pool, Jack Dorsey discussion on Joe Rogan last night. But I don't think a lot of people realize this. Tim Pool is a Bernie bro.
Yeah, he voted for Bernie.
He voted for Bernie, and he went on Minds.com a few weeks ago, and he said, do people realize that I'm like not a conservative, and if Bernie runs again, before Bernie announced, I'm voting for Bernie? Like, here's the thing. Things have to be so weird and ass backwards when Tim Pool, a Bernie bro, a person who's left of center, becomes a champion of free speech and individual expression. Like, I'm happy, and he's on our side. But it's so strange because you have people like that who are on board. Cassandra Fairbanks, one of my favorite journalists out there. She's a Bernie bro who voted for Trump. It had less to do with the fact that she loved Trump and more the fact that she hated people like Clinton, who's going to go ahead and dictate every facet of her life. We have this beautiful, collection of people who are all very unique individuals. And while we disagree on a whole bunch of stuff, there's just this one thing that really comes out. Bro, don't tell me how to live my life. And if you're going to use the force of the state to do it, or you're going to use a monopolistic entity like Twitter or something else, we're going to fight back, and we're going to make some weird freaking alliances. When you have Tucker Carlson and my presidential crush of the month, Tulsi Gabbard, going ahead and having a beautiful conversation about the deep state and the military-industrial complex, and they're like, we're cool on this, everything else we're not. That creates a thing that freaks people out because that's not supposed to happen, but it is.
To play devil's advocate here, this article that I was reading in a New York magazine, I think it was kind of tongue-in-cheek when it came to how a lot of the mainstream New Yorkers view a lot of the Chapo Trap House type dirtbag socialists, as they're called. Although I don't know if that's the exact term they use. But anyway,
I love the one description she uses: a granola Gen Xer.
With the neoliberals. The one thing that I've had in my mind for quite a long time, despite whatever disagreements all of us have with them, it's kind of like a devil you know type of thing, where even if we see these creeping examples of authoritarianism throughout these past decades, I don't think that these are the people who would necessarily want to institute the martial law a la 1984 that a lot of people perceive them wanting to institute. And I think it's absolutely fair them perceive that and to challenge people like Dianne Feinstein when she talks about taking away people's guns. Like, that's a constant back and forth battle. But then when we have the Green New Deal type of folks coming in there, like, they're the ones who seem to be inheriting the legacy of the Weather Underground, one of whose compatriots who then quit, I believe, had an interview where he talked about how the Weather Underground planned to put people who are dissenters into these re-educational camps and do other kinds of horrible...
It's crazy crap, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's crazy
so then when I take a look at the neoliberals, I'm like, okay, I may not like a lot of the things that they stand for, but at the same time, I think partly what they were doing with a lot of this woke culture for the past couple of years, and even earlier than that, is I think they were humoring the extreme left. I think they were appealing to them, saying like, hey, we're on your side, so that they wouldn't get that extreme. For example, if we're looking at the Labour Party in England back in the day, that was a really contentious period when England could have also turned out just like Soviet Russia did. But because they instituted certain social programs, it calmed people down, and today we don't have a system there like we had in the Soviet Union. So that aspect of the elite, and again, I'm not so much for a vertical elite as I am for a horizontal elite, just like an elite by people proving themselves and getting better at certain things and inspiring others. But if we're still talking about certain old boy clubs, certain societies where people know each other and that's how they get hired, it's not the greatest thing, but at the same time, having them fight against those who want to make sure that they don't gain too much power, it still seems better, because I don't think that at the end of the day, they necessarily want to create this dystopia that I see being created by more far leftist type people.
Well, people are starting to talk more about universal basic income. And it's very interesting to me that this was something Milton Friedman would talk about. This is something that Hayek would talk about, but not a Bernie Sanders version where we have our current welfare state and all our bureaucratic glut, and then we add universal basic income on top of it. What Hayek and Milton Friedman would propose is you basically, like you said earlier, like demolish the state, or you get rid of most of what we have, right? Because if for every tax dollar that is put into the government, like people get back like what? Like 30 cents of it or something. Like you could, by crushing the state and minimizing it, you could even give people like more direct redistribution. If you want to have something like a sliding scale income tax, which I actually am against, I'm for the flat tax. But if you want to have something like a negative income tax, where at a certain point, like if you're below a certain threshold, the government owes you money, right? Like if you're making, $20,000 or something, like you have a negative income tax, and then you get to a certain point and then it's a flat tax.
Absolutely. And, UBI, and I talk about this only for like a sentence in the book, but UBI is one of those things where, libertarians are so split on it. I'm one of the, loud vocal minorities amongst libertarians within the liberty movement who actually supports UBI. And, I've been bringing up a lot of examples of Democrat presidential candidate Andrew Yang, but even like, his example of UBI, while it's smart to a certain degree, you got to look at the whole picture. And I think the whole picture wise, it's a disaster, because what does he say? Rent control, single payer health care, all this other stuff. So it's like what you mentioned. It's like what a Bernie Sanders solution of this would look like. Let's just add UBI on top of everything else. But, you mentioned Friedman. There was a really interesting example of one campaign policy regarding UBI. It was actually out in California. The Libertarian Party candidate for governor there, Zoltan Istvan, who's a transhumanist philosopher and stuff. Like he talks about federal land dividend, where you go ahead and you basically rent out federal lands to companies, and basically the rent they pay would be redistributed to everyone in California. From there, you can go ahead and you could destroy the housing department. You could take care of a lot of stuff. You could downsize the welfare state just by giving people cash. And for me,
and Andrew Yang is another guy. I feel like if Tim Pool is saying he's a Bernie bro, I would love to find a way to like nudge him to someone more like Andrew Yang. Zoltan, I love. I personally know Zoltan. I've invited him to an event. I've gone to an event with him. He's kind of he's kind of wacky and awesome at the same time. Like at the event I invited a bunch of people to, he started talking about, like, he had a whole slideshow, and I remember there was a part of the slideshow when he was saying, like, some people might want to be cat people or fish people. and then like the people that I invited literally like looked over to me and they're like, what is going, like, who are we listening to right now? Like, this dude's like, don't worry, bro. Like, we're gonna make the cat people. And it's like, oh my God, like, this is terrible.
You should have brought in the furries. I think the furries would have gotten so much out of him.
He's like, some people might want to grow a tail, and it's like, why is this in your slideshow?
I had him on my show about a year ago while he was running for governor, and I started off with, so people are telling me you're the Antichrist. What's your take on that? And he's like, well, you know, it's about your opinion of the devil. And I was like, okay, let's talk about this.
No, he sent me an email. We were trying to raise money. He asked me to help him if I could put him in touch with people. He was trying to start a show, and he wanted the show to be called The Antichrist Show. And at the time when he sent me, I was like, this is a terrible idea. I don't like your branding. Like, that is the wrong approach. And then a year went by, and I was thinking about it, and I was like, because like I started just paying attention to like how pop stars are successful, and like you listen to the stuff musicians sing, and you just listen to the stuff that, you know, the people that talk to Ellen on talk shows, you just see everything in the media, and you're like, well, it's clearly not as repulsive as I thought. Like, clearly I'm the one that needs to be taken to school and take notes, because Zoltan is clearly onto something that wasn't privy to. And so it took me a little time to catch up with not being overly sensitive. I needed my emotions exfoliated a little bit so that I could
Zoltan is woke.
So I could listen.
But what we're talking about, yeah. But like, I think technical foul. I think you know, like a federal land dividend, for example. I don't see how that's a negative thing, because if you're going to say we have public lands, I don't really believe the government should own lands, but you know, we live in a world where they do. If you're going to go ahead and make some money off of it, might as well give it back to the taxpayers who are the owners of the land. So, I mean,
and how much of that land, by the way, is like canyon land? Is land that, like, the environmentalists who worry about the forest getting polluted and dumped on don't necessarily have to worry that much if we're talking about much more of a rocky territory.
I mean, I don't know, but like, you know, I tell people, look at Vegas. Vegas shouldn't exist. Vegas is in like the worst part of the country. It's hot, and you're going to go ahead and build a bunch of casinos and strip clubs and machine gun ranges and golf courses, and you're going to hope that people go there and spend money. That's not going to work, but it does.
Right. Well, Vegas is our Dubai a little bit. It was just like a desert town that money poured into, and they just made it into like a playground for adults, and it's kind of its own beast.
That's the best way to describe it. If we can make Vegas work, like, wave of the future, man. Let people do weird stuff. Let them make some money. If it means that we're going to get something out of it.
We have to make libertarianism work as well. Unfortunately, if you have folks like that stripping guy going on stage, that and Aleppo, as you have on your cover, those are the things that are going to stay in people's minds much more than any of the more pragmatic and down-to-earth things. So, like you were talking about in your book, how you wanted people to dress up better, not to look like disheveled neckbeards. And that presentation has a lot to do with it, which is why I think having Ocasio-Cortez go to that State of the Union address wearing white like some kind of a futuristic wizard, like that appeals to people. Like, people take a look at that imagery, and it combines in their mind, I think, with something like Game of Thrones, with something like they're watching a movie, because in a way, maybe they are. Maybe this is all one big movie. But anyway, if that can be utilized by people who actually want to make the world a better place and can look further beyond taking money away from the 1%, and that's going to solve all our problems, that will be a good thing. But unfortunately, like we were talking about before, about this Nick Jr. mentality, people tend to look at a lot of this stuff in the first layer. they don't then take the other step to say what's going to happen.
I'm sorry, I love that.
Okay.
That Nick Jr. mentality.
It's all right.
The Nick Jr. mentality is real. The Nick Jr. mentality is real.
No,
and it's
it is.
pervasive.
It's just so weird.
It's
when I hear
corrosive
stuff
to mental
out.
machinery. No, it's out there. No, we gotta diagnose it and we gotta cure it or something.
Wave of the
Assimilate
future,
best
man.
Well,
parts and-
here's an example. Speaking of wave of the future, at this event that Chapo Trap House was in, it was talking about this is the main one that anyone on television is going to be asked. How's it going to get paid for when they're talking about worldwide or America-wide socialism? Quote, we've already seen Alexandria get asked over and over, it's important to come up with a smart response. The smart response is, all the numbers are correct. All this is true about the deficit. But fuck the deficit because it's not real and it doesn't matter. The audience whooped. Another option, he said, is to turn all the existing billionaires into millionaires or Soylent.
I watched that Alexandria dance video many times for research purposes.
Of course.
And like here's the thing, like I'll admit it, I'm much more lenient towards attractive people. And I mentioned this in the book. Like there's this beautiful, she was just so drop dead freaking gorgeous. Who'd you rather talk to and pay attention to, her or the dude who smells like mold? Everyone's gonna run to her.
Well, we had Joy Vila who had the Make America Great Again dress on during an award ceremony. And I don't know if that many leftists were running to her direction. And that's the current divide right now, right? Like, I don't know what exactly it's going to take to get people who, like, I get Jules's argument that it would be great to be able to talk with Cortez and see what you can agree on and learn from each other and all that good stuff. But I still think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if it isn't easier to talk with people who happen to be more in this centrist, left-leaning type of place. And I know that there's a lot of these folks in New York City who just happen to be taken in by a lot of the more extreme socialism, leftism, because there's not really that much choice. In a way, like, maybe Donald Trump is a little bit to blame for this, because if he elicits all of these emotions from people who don't happen to be these extreme socialists, like, who are they going to go to here? Like, they don't have to go to Trump, but it seems like the left has portrayed anybody who is against leftism as somebody who is their imaginary version of Donald Trump or a Donald Trump supporter.
Yeah, so in, like, you know, New York State, for example, a friend of mine was running for governor as a libertarian, Larry Sharp. Larry Sharp.
Hey, I know Larry Sharp.
Yeah, Larry Sharp is one of the most popular libertarians in the country, and he ran a full-on professional campaign. What ended up happening, though, after 2 years of running? Came in fourth place. He lost out. In second place was a no-name Republican who was just there to be the sacrificial lamb. Third place was a Socialist Green Party candidate. Fourth place was a communist. And then fifth was Larry Sharp. And you have someone who's running a campaign, talking to everybody, not necessarily putting out explicitly libertarian things, but he was trying to, you know, talk to the voters, see what mattered to his constituency. And what ends up happening? The guy got skewered. Came in fifth in the two-man race, as far as most people were concerned, outside observers. But it's complicated. And I think it's so important to start these conversations and just to be friendly. I think the internet is terrible for many reasons because we've taken out that face-to-face interaction that most humanity has been used to for a while. But now what we've done is we've dehumanized each other. And instead of actually having, you know, actual civil discourse, it's all about, you know, it's like absolute warfare. You gotta
dunking on each other and that kind of stuff.
But do you think, in a way, Donald Trump is partly responsible for that as well, for the seeing red on behalf of the more left-leaning people, where they would just associate anybody who happens to be to the right of Chairman Mao with this type of intensity? And not to say that some of it may not have been warranted. Like, I noticed a lot of it was him reacting to what people were saying to Donald Trump. But there are various ways of going about it, maybe. Like, wouldn't there have been a better way, and I could be completely wrong about this, but just for the sake of argument, would not there have been a better way for somebody to say these things a lot calmer and then not attract that much attention to themselves, while in the meantime pulling off various policy changes without having as much propaganda that the other side could use against them.
I don't agree with that, or else Mitt Romney would have been president.
That's a good point.
And that's the thing. Like, they made Mitt Romney out to be Satan, who's pushing Granny off of cliffs, who's taking away your health care, putting women in binders, and his dog on his, on the top of his car,
and killing Big Bird.
Like, and what did Mitt Romney do? That's not nice. No, now. We need to talk about the deficit. Like, no, I think Trump, while, he certainly has to take some blame for it, I think he's more of a result than he is a catalyst. And I think he is and I'm pretty ambivalent towards him, but I think he represents the good and the bad. I think he's a Rorschach test, a black mirror, if you will.
And I don't necessarily, I want to travel around America and speak to people. I don't really know what most people in middle America are like, as far as the way that they are in private. The people who I have spoken to, when I was, let's say, in Savannah, Georgia, everybody was super nice, but that is also like a city. If we're talking about people who are living more in the backwoods of the country, I think that's what a lot of city slickers are most concerned about. They don't want those people to have a certain, bad mindset about other people. What's your take on that? Do you think that things have changed in the, in the amount of time, from the 1980s or 1990s to now?
I mean, I'd like to, I'm not painting broad brushstrokes here, but I think they have. I mean, I just published an article over at the Advocates for Self-Government a few days ago, and I was talking about how, we largely ignored the anniversary of Executive Order 3066 by Franklin Roosevelt, which was the executive order which created the process for Japanese internment camps during World War II. And that wasn't even a full century ago, but we rarely talk about it. And I mean, we really ignore a lot about, things like that. But, it's hard to find anyone today that would have said after 9/11, let's get all of our Arab and Muslim populations and put them in an internment camp. That would not fly in 2001. It wouldn't fly now.
Internment camps, but I definitely am curious how people are going to try to convey what's going on in China. They have those re-education camps where they force extremists to eat pork and do all sorts of other things. And then you have the Prince of Saudi Arabia saying he approves. So if you find no-go zone areas in the future in America, you have people, praising ISIS or, whatever it is that extremist cells do, if you suddenly say, okay, you guys have to eat pork or you have to go through some kind of re-education, humanely modeled after what China's doing that's been approved by the Prince of Saudi Arabia, are we going to be accused of this is like Auschwitz? Oh, this is like Japanese internment camps. Oh, we're going back to our cruel origins, and that that you're ignoring compassion, when really it's the difference between empathy and compassion is empathy is being able to relate to someone or feel what another person feels, but it should be in order to make the negative feelings go away. If someone's going through despair and you're empathizing with them, the purpose of empathizing with them should be to help their despair go away. It shouldn't be to just share misery for the sake of it. And that's where compassion comes in, because sometimes compassion seems cold. Sometimes compassion seems harsh, but sometimes it's when you got to get rid of a cramp, sometimes you just got to dig into it, and it hurts first, but that's the only way you get the cramp to go away. And it's just I read on Harvard Business Review, the most persuasive people at first have to make you very uncomfortable. If you're not good at making people very
the
uncomfortable,
Antichrist show.
Yeah,
Hmm.
if you're exactly, yeah, or right, like how to win in politics and other forms of devil worship. It's crazy, like you say that kind of stuff, and it's shocking, right? But I feel like politics is now entering a shock realm. You know, we have our shock rap, we have our shock rock. You know, you have all
I
sorts
have
of
a question
performance
for you,
art, and
real
now
fast.
politics is coming into that limelight.
Would you say that politics is the new pop culture?
It's absolutely. I think it's all this with Trump. The fact that Trump has totally changed the game. He's reset the media, the mainstream media, and politics single-handedly, right? So now, what's acceptable in the mainstream media and what's acceptable in politics, and what's considered credible or acceptable, it's all completely changed. Nobody trusts the media anymore, which I think is fantastic. Everybody's doubting everything and skeptical of everything, which is really healthy pre 1984 Brave New World, when people are trying to like pass these TPPs, and you know, people are like, what are these rules, what are these laws? And it's like sometimes it feels like the politicians are playing a game of Go around you, and like the citizens like aren't even aware of the board game they're playing. It's like, wait, you're surrounding all my pieces, like what is that about? And it's like, oh shit.
Well, that's why I really want to start looking with Jules together at things like Agenda 21, or now they have Agenda 2030, and soberly take a look at all these things, not talking about, you know, putting people in these detainment camps, but just simply looking at them and saying, like, what are the worst ramifications that could come from all these things? Or the Trilateral Commission, which I know that Barry Goldwater didn't have great things to say about. So I don't want to put all these things in the categories of lizard people trying to take over the world through DMT demonic forces, but I just want to put it in the category of regular people just like you and me who happen to get certain amounts of power, and just like any government entity, want to get more power and hold on to it. And that's always going to be something we're going to fight against. The one thing that gives me a lot of hope, though, is that if we look back in the 1970s, there were a lot of bombings that were occurring in the United States during that time by communists. And those communists were being supported by Mother Russia, by the USSR, which they don't necessarily have anymore. So as far as people, though, like I know George Soros is singled out as this boogeyman, but again, this is something that we have to read a lot more into. And I'm just curious who you see as being big obstacles today in trying to prevent authoritarianism from taking over.
I don't think there's necessarily one person, because if there was, like, you know, a few years ago, I would have said it was Hillary Clinton. And after we beat her, it's going to be, you know, peace, pipes, and rainbows. And when it comes to these ideas, you know, I joked for a while about how to combat ISIS without firing a single bullet. And I said, let's airdrop pornography, Game of Thrones, blue jeans, and McDonald's into Syria.
Well, like, yeah, that's kind of like what America was doing with
soft
Russia.
power for the win.
Yeah, like Mia Khalifa could be our battle flag if we really wanted to. But like, you know, JR from Dallas, like he was used as a anti-capitalist propaganda piece in the Soviet Union. And then what ends up happening, you have all these guys, because not everyone can be the communal artist. They're growing grain and they're getting the crap beaten out of them by the KGB. They're looking at this JR guy from Texas with the big hat and the nice cars and everything else, and they're like, damn, maybe capitalism ain't too bad.
Right.
And you start to kill them from within. In that sense, you start to kill the ideology. So I think there's never going to be one person, there's never going to be one group. It's going to be you know, dangerous ideologies and dangerous ideas that can manifest themselves in different ways, like, you know, democratic socialism. I mean, what's the end of the day? What's the end goal? And they state this themselves.
It's more of the same, because they've been going in this direction for so long, right? So I feel like the end game has to just be, government has a mind of its own, right? The bureaucracy, like people like sometimes think of like shadowy figures, you know, like around a table and they're plotting and scheming, when I really think that the way our government works is it's just a mindless bureaucracy, right? And so it wants more power and control. Like, I think it sees its role as like a utilitarian function of, hey, we're trying to make everyone's lives better. And I think that the problem with government is good intentions aren't good enough, right? Like government spends too much time trying to do good instead of trying not to do evil. And it's not a semantic difference, right? Like if you're actively trying to do good, that's where they say, you know, the path of good intentions is the road to hell or something, right? As in like a lot of evil has been done in the name of trying to do good. Like when Cortez thinks that the environmental crisis that we have, whatever that is, she thinks it's our new world, it's our World War II. Like there are people who genuinely believe that the primary existential crisis is the environment. And there's people on right who think the primary existential crisis is extremist terrorism, when really I think the primary existential crisis is authoritarian government, right? And I think people need to really wake up to that first, because even if there is an environmental crisis, the free market would solve all those problems faster, right? I also don't think the environmental crisis is what people say it is. I think that people like to talk about anthropogenic global warming and it's all the CO2 is messing up our atmosphere, when really I think it's the sun is the dominant factor in what determines our climates and weather. And so I sympathize when someone like Cortez is like fearing doomsday because of, you know, like it's going to be the day after tomorrow and, you know, and the world's going to break. So we need the government to not seize control of the means of production, but to seize control of the means of production in order to save the environment. And so she wants to do good, but the problem is she's too busy trying to do good and not busy enough trying to not do evil, right? And that's why she says things like it's more important to be morally right than factually right. And I don't even like disagree with her sentiment.
I don't get angry. I didn't get angry when she said that, because I get what she's saying, because that is the mindset of a lot of people.
Yeah, but and that's where I know that Cortez has a good heart, and I think she's coming from the right place. And I think that when she says that she wants to persuade everyone, she's like, there's no state too red, there's no one too conservative that I don't want to persuade. Because to me, that's earnest. That's good faith. That's saying, I want to persuade or be persuaded, right? And to me, that's why I think we're very fortunate to have Cortez as the face to this burgeoning movement, so people can talk about it, dissect it, and see what needs to be fixed.
Yeah, this is why I've never been mad at her.
Right.
Like, and I go beyond the sound bites. Like each time I see a negative article written about her, like a lot of people on the right are so eager to make her out to be the new Satan and everything that they end up kind of falling into her traps on certain things. Like in terms of like my least favorite politician, she's not even in the top 10. There are more Republicans I dislike than her.
If Cortez becomes a libertarian, it would be so huge for her to like, because she's in the system, she's learning politics, she's, you know, it's a hard job, I imagine. It is not easy, and everyone's coming at you, and people are heckling you.
Well,
I can only imagine how stressful that is, and how much responsibility she's assumed for herself. But you know, I love that she's punching up, and she's trying to affect radical change, and that's why we need to have these discussions, get people educated, and figure these things out, because I think that she is catastrophically wrong about a lot of things. And I do think that one of the fatal flaws in her direction is she's too busy trying to do good and not busy enough trying to not do evil.
Well, I can imagine there could be reasons for this you guys could bring forth. Why do you think she didn't go for the debate with Ben Shapiro?
Jules, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to?
I think that it's the same reason why Jack was willing to go on to the Joe Rogan show. When you have a moderated conversation with a host, like conversations are a lot more productive when they're less performative. Because like the thing about debates is it's kind of like trial by combat, like Game of Thrones style, right? It's kind of about like how much flair and performance can you put into it? Like, what cherry picked information do you have? How do you make your opponent look bad? And I don't think they're productive in different ways, and they're satisfying in different ways. But as far as like the real catharsis and the real productive conversations, I think that it's better when they're conversations like this or like Joe Rogan. And debates should be reserved for, I even think debates are better when people like each other a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Like when you have debates between people that like really dislike each other, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, like we were talking with BJ Murphy, who is a technocratic communist dude, but he's a great dude. Like, we had a wonderful conversation with the guy. It wasn't necessarily about socialism, but still, it's an example of people who don't agree on certain things still being able to enjoy talking with each other.
Yeah, like my debate partner back in college, he was a very far right person. I always played the liberal card when I was with him, but we debated each other, and we did like Lincoln Douglas style debates. We usually never even had a moderator because we respected each other and we were genuine friends. And the debate came out of discussions we had, so we were like, why not do this? So like that was fine. And I just want to put out a disclaimer: like, Ben Shapiro did endorse my book. I think maybe it was because he only read the title, and so it was like, yeah, you gotta stay away from these libertarian guys. So I don't quite know how much of it he read, but I appreciated the sales bump. But you watch Ben Shapiro debate, and I try and tell people when they say, "Oh yeah, I love Ben Shapiro and how he's owning the libs," I'm like, does he debate to win, or does he debate to change people's minds? And I think maybe this is because he's a lawyer. So he has to have that, kill or be killed mentality, but he debates to win, because I don't know anyone that was ever on the left that changed their opinion on something because of Ben Shapiro.
My girlfriend says he persuaded her on some things, but I think, I think he has done a lot to empower traditional conservatism or brands of what people think is traditional conservatism.
Like, I came into libertarianism through economics before I became a full-time, partially employed smart aleck. I actually was a white paper pusher. Like, I did a lot of policy papers. I go represent nonprofits. I try and push out these elaborate white papers no one would read. But, ultimately, what do we teach in terms of economics in like high school, for example? Macro and micro. Like, that's what it comes down to. No one's your average American has no clue what Austrian business cycle is. And even if they've heard of it, what are the odds that they know the difference between that and Chicago school economics? Like, what we've done is we've narrowed in our thinking. And I think that is ultimately the biggest problem. And I fear I fear less of a world of 1984. And I know we've been alluding to this throughout the show in references, but I fear a brave new world where we're so flooded by knowledge that we choose to be willfully ignorant.
That's a good point. But I also hope that in the midst of all this knowledge, I imagine it's like a tornado, with the eye being the calmest area, where people are able to gather through all these different connections that we're getting right now. Like, I had no idea who you were or what culture was several months ago, but now it seems like so many people are interacting together. And I think that's going to create, inside of this eye of the tornado, an inner renaissance, which will then spread out through the rest of this chaotic tornado. And there will probably be a little bit of chaos that we're going to have to contend with. I don't think it's going to be at the level of the bombings that occurred during the 1970s, financed partly by the USSR. But I still think that we're going to have, I think it's, in a way, it's a good thing. We need to have pressure to overcome, and this may sound a little bit metaphysical. Here I go with the metaphysicality again. But I think we're growing our egos out right now, and we've been doing that since the past several millennia. Where before, if you take a look at ancient Greek art, you would see all these little figures depicted as like puppets, where they didn't even attribute their own ego, their own sense of being to whatever decision they made. It was more of like, the gods imbued me with a certain passion. This is why I got angry at my spouse. So I think we've been moving much more towards a me, centric environment, especially with us not having to interact as much with other people, being in our own little internet bubbles. But I think it's a prerequisite to us figuring out that this is so boring and that we want to eventually get out of it. We have something the Kabbalists refer to as I think like a pin in the heart or a light in the heart or something like that, where we want to seek out something more. We want to seek out connectedness with other people, not because we're forced to, because otherwise the bear's going to eat us, but because it's way better than just being insulated from everything.
Exactly. And, to kind of recap on that, like, one part of my book I talk about is I had this very conservative professor at Liberty University. And I think I'm the only person in America complaining about, oh yeah, one time this conservative professor. That's not something you typically hear. But I really love the guy. He was a great influence on me. But he did not like libertarians because he said that we absolutized the market. And he constantly brought up, well, if you just went with Adam Smith's book, and you just focus on the invisible hand of the market and everything else. Wealth of Nations, that's it. If you just focus on Wealth of Nations as your Bible, you're going to have people dying in the streets because you're going to have someone that privatizes all the water there, and you're not going to be able to get water anywhere. Yeah, and that was the thing. Like, I mentioned this to him. I'm like, Professor, I get this kind of slight exaggeration you're making about Wealth of Nations, but look at what the sequel was, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And what he emphasized was people want to live in community with each other in some way. No one lives in a vacuum, and no one's going to ever perceive that they are the only ones on the small little libertarian islands. They want to have fulfilling relationships. They want to have meaning. They want to go out and they want to do good things that sometimes might not be good for their wallets, but they want to do it because it instills with them a sense of pride that only they can define. Well, and he was like, yeah, but no one ever reads that book.
Well, that's the pursuit of happiness that you were talking about being much more favorable to you at the end of the day than the original quote by one of the founding fathers. It was private property instead of the pursuit of happiness. But then you started to see that the pursuit of happiness is actually more suitable.
Exactly, and that was John Locke. A lot of libertarians get mad because they're like, that leftist Thomas Jefferson, and people used to get mad when I was doing a lot of webcasts. Well, I've got a bust of Thomas Jefferson right here. I live in Virginia, so obviously I got Rep Monticello when I'm in Charlottesville, for example. But, there was a certain degree to it that pursuit of happiness is something that you never saw in any legal document in all of human history. And what pursuit of happiness for America meant was that you can define that yourself. And that was a beautiful thing. And I think a lot of libertarians somewhat ignore that because they're like, that's that progressive, fluffy language that can lead to communism. I'm like, no, if you really understand the backing of that, you're going to see that it's a very beautiful thing and you can respect it on that ground alone.
Yeah, what else are we living for, honestly, at the end of the day? Like, it's not just to have order for order's sake. Otherwise, we'd just be a bunch of robots living in these concrete, brutalist-style buildings, just going about our day, I don't know, just making widgets all the time. So there is definitely something to that. And however people find happiness, maybe it is going to be like the finding universal consciousness or unity or whatever you want to call it, as long as it's not forced upon people. Because when that shit's forced upon you, then the opposite ends up happening, I think. So,
and I think people who don't have faith in the market or don't understand why people would have faith in the market, like I have faith in humanity, right? I have faith in the market the same way I have faith in humanity, right? And I think that, you can go to Richard Dawkins' book. He wrote in the foreword to The Selfish Gene, he wishes that he had named it something else. And he says if he could rename his book The Selfish Gene, he would name it The Selfish Gene Drives the Altruistic Vehicle. One of the things he talks about in his book were blood bats, how vampire bats would go out, drink blood, come back, and if one bat came back and hadn't eaten, the other bats would regurgitate to feed the bat blood. But
that's gross and kind.
But if that bat came back repeatedly, having eaten, and wouldn't regurgitate blood to help other bats when they were hungry, the bats would let it starve, right? So let's say you keep coming back empty-handed, and then the other batch are like, oh, we'll help you out so you don't starve. And then you come back having eaten, and there are instances when someone else needs help. If that bat that was being helped doesn't help one of the other bats in need, the bats will then let it starve next time it needs help.
That's freaking insane.
But
nature is so freaking crazy.
Yeah, right. But how doesn't that seem like human logic almost? Doesn't that just seem like common sense? It's sort of like help, right? Like that's an example of like helping everyone is in everyone's interest and in your own interest. Like making everyone strong is good for you, right? Like the reason why wolves will like fight with each other is so when like they come against a predator, like they're really good at fighting. Do you know what I mean? Like if you just say like, oh, no one should be roughhousing, no one should be arguing, no one should be fighting, you just deprive people of so much stress that when like real stress comes your way, you're just incapable of dealing with it. And I feel like that's the problem with like snowflake culture and like coddling the American mind, is that people need like more stressful conversations. We need to look at how we are strengthening each other and shaping each other and what we want our culture to look like in the future. And we don't want to be blindsided or conquered inadvertently by people we don't see coming.
That's absolutely great. Yeah. Well, Remso, thank you so much for being our guest. And we definitely hope to have you back again as soon as we finish reading the book. It's been a fascinating read so far. And for everybody who's curious about this book, and you definitely should be, it's called Stay Away from the Libertarians by Remso Martinez, available at Amazon. And where else could you get it? Amazon and Barnes & Noble online. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. It's been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for having on, and best of luck with everything you're doing in the future. I'm glad to be a part of it.